For centuries, Buddhism was this huge spiritual force all across India. But then, it just seemed to fade away from the very land where it was born. Now, we all think we know that story, right? Its rise, its fall. But what if that story is just that, a story? What if the ground beneath our feet, the actual archaeological evidence, tells a completely different tale?
Okay, let's just jump right in with this bombshell from archaeologist Lars Fogelin. What he's saying is, when you stop relying only on the ancient texts and you start looking at the physical stuff, the ruins of monasteries, the inscriptions on stone, the whole story of Buddhism in India that we've been told starts to look, well, wrong. This is basically a historical detective story, and the crime scene is our own past. So first, let's just quickly go over the story most of us are familiar with. This is the version of history that's been built almost entirely from Buddhist scriptures and texts.
We have this powerful image, right? It's deeply ingrained. The Buddha is the ultimate wandering ascetic who gave up everything. And his followers, the early Sangha, they're these propertyless wanderers begging for food. But here is the absolute kicker. This entire narrative comes almost exclusively from texts that were written down, get this, 500 to 800 years after the Buddha actually lived. That massive time gap, that's the key. Remember that.
Okay, so let's put those texts aside for a minute. Let's pick up a different tool, the archaeologist's trowel. We're going to look at what people actually did, not just what a handful of monks wrote.
So, the archaeology of religion isn't really about philosophy or deep theology. No, it looks at the hard evidence, the foundations of buildings, the objects people left behind, how sacred spaces were laid out. It tells us about the daily life of the majority, not just the big ideas of a tiny educated elite. And this is where the plot twist comes in. And this timeline just lays it all out so clearly. Look at this. The Buddha lived around the 6th century BCE, but we have pretty much zero physical Buddhist remains from that time. The first major evidence, stupas, monasteries, that stuff only shows up around the 3rd century BCE. And those texts, the ones describing the early ascetic period, they were written even later. We're talking centuries later. There is a huge gap between the supposed events and the stories being written about them. So, what does the earliest physical evidence actually show us? Well, it shows us the exact opposite of a wandering, propertyless movement. It's a total reversal. This is the knockout punch. The texts say, ascetics came first, monasteries developed slowly over time. But the archaeology says, nope. From the very first moment we can see anything at all, we see large, organized, and wealthy monasteries. Inscription after inscription records donations not just from regular people, but from monks and nuns themselves who clearly had their own money. The story on the ground is one of established, land-owning institutions, not wandering beggars. It's a complete flip of the script.
And this is the big question, isn't it? If the reality from the very beginning was about settled monasteries, why on earth did the later text insist on this origin story of wandering ascetics? What was going on?
Well, the answer seems to be that these texts weren't really trying to be objective history. They were a kind of invented tradition. Hundreds of years later, a new faction of monks popped up. They were really into a more ascetic, back-to-the-forest kind of lifestyle. So, to give their own views more weight and to challenge the rich, powerful monasteries of their day, they wrote a new history. A history that portrayed the Buddha himself as the original ascetic. They basically projected their own ideals all the way back to the beginning to make their movement seem more legit. It was a really clever bit of religious politics, actually.
And this isn't just about changing an origin story. This new, archaeologically backed history actually helps us explain the biggest mystery of all. Why did Buddhism eventually fade away in India? The answer lies in a growing divide, a massive gap between the monks and the everyday people.
The trigger for this split, it was economic. You see, in the beginning, monasteries depended on daily donations from the local community, food, cash, goods. This meant the monks had to interact with people every single day. But then, starting around the 2nd century CE, royal patronage started to change. Kings began gifting not just money, but huge pieces of land, even entire villages, directly to the monasteries.
And you can see how this would set off a chain reaction, right? Suddenly, the monasteries are financially independent. They become self-sufficient landlords, they don't need daily donations from the common people anymore, and this financial freedom allowed the Sangha to do something many had wanted to do for a long time: withdraw from the messy world. They built high walls, they focused inward on really complex philosophy and scholasticism, and they became more and more isolated from the very people who once supported them. And that economic independence, that social isolation, well, that's what set the stage for Buddhism's long, slow decline in the very place it was born.
It really boils down to this. By becoming landlords and scholars, the Sangha lost its popular base. The connection was severed. When a farmer or a merchant had a problem or a spiritual need, they didn't go to the secluded monks behind those high walls anymore.
So it wasn't just one thing. It was this cascade of factors, a domino effect. The Sangha's isolation created a vacuum. The common people still needing spiritual guidance turned to more accessible traditions, especially the rising bhakti movements in Hinduism. Over time, as politics shifted, kings started giving their money to these more popular groups instead of the Buddhist monasteries, and this made the monasteries incredibly vulnerable. So when political conflicts happened and temples were targeted, which was a common practice by Indian rulers of all faiths to show their power, the Buddhist monasteries had no local support base left to protect them or demand they be rebuilt. They had become islands, and the tide of public support had simply gone out.
So what this new history shows us is that Buddhism's decline wasn't really about foreign invasions or some big philosophical debate. It was a slow internal process of disconnection. Which leaves us with a final question to chew on. Did Buddhism ever truly vanish from India? Or maybe, after losing its big institutions, its ideas and its practices were just absorbed back into the incredibly rich, diverse spiritual soil of India where you can still find its traces today. What do you think?